The entire dining room of the grand establishment fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. One could have heard the sharp chime of a thin silver needle striking the pristine white marble floor beneath the feet of the elite. Julian Brookfield, the most sought-after billionaire bachelor in the entire state, had just uttered the most ridiculously cruel thing anyone could possibly conceive. He pointed a diamond-studded cufflink finger directly at the trembling waitress, whose simple uniform was entirely soaked in expensive, bubbling champagne. He sneered loudly, asking her if she truly expected him to forgive her clumsiness just because she uttered an apology. Then, with a cold, mocking laugh, he told her that if she could sing a complex classical aria perfectly, without a single mistake, he would marry her right then and there. The lavish room immediately erupted into a wave of cruel, mocking laughter from the wealthy patrons. His beautiful fiancée smiled with sheer malice, fully expecting the poor girl to burst into tears and run away in total humiliation. However, none of them had any idea who this young woman truly was beneath her cheap clothing. They did not know that the girl in the stained uniform was about to open her mouth and bring the most powerful man in the city to his very knees. This is the incredible story of Elena Vance, and the single, beautiful song that changed the course of her entire existence. The Obsidian Vista was not merely a high-end restaurant. It was a theater of immense wealth and social cruelty. And on this particular evening, the upper-class audience was exceptionally ruthless. Massive crystal chandeliers dripped from the high ceilings like frozen tears, casting fractured, sparkling light upon the politicians, oil barons, and technology magnates who were busy dining on caviar that cost far more than a small family automobile. Elena Vance quietly adjusted the stiff collar of her cheap black uniform, feeling it scratch uncomfortably against her neck as a constant reminder of her low social standing. She was completely invisible here, a mere ghost, gliding silently between the tables to refill water glasses, clear, heavy silver plates, and absorb the casual, unthinking contempt of the urban elite. "Bring more wine to this table immediately," a sharp, demanding voice snapped from the center of the crowded room. Elena turned around quickly, keeping her gaze lowered respectfully as she answered Miss Thorne, who sat at the central table, acting as the undisputed queen of the evening. Isabella Thorne wore a striking red silk dress that looked as though it had been poured directly over her slender body, and on her finger, a massive diamond sparkled heavily. Next to her sat the wealthy man who had purchased that ring, Julian Brookfield, the 33-year-old chief executive officer of Brookfield Dynamics, a man who could move entire financial markets with a single whisper. Tonight, however, Julian looked completely bored, staring down at his phone rather than listening to his fiancée complain about the specific garnish on her expensive lobster. "Julian, are you even paying attention to me?" Isabella hissed loudly, her perfectly manicured fingernails tapping sharply against the white linen tablecloth. "I said that the soprano singer you hired for our upcoming wedding is completely average, and I will absolutely not tolerate mediocrity at a Brookfield wedding." Julian sighed deeply, finally sliding his expensive phone into the pocket of his tailored tuxedo, before looking at her with dark, intelligent, and exhausted eyes. "Isabella, it is a wedding, not a royal coronation," Julian replied in a deep, calm voice. "Nobody is going to analyze the vocal technique of the singer while they are busy getting drunk on vintage champagne." "I will analyze it," Isabella countered icily, her eyes flashing with anger. Elena stepped closer to the table holding a bottle of deep red wine, her hands steady despite the fact that her heart was hammering wildly against her ribs. Being this close to Julian Brookfield was always deeply unsettling, because of the intense, overwhelming strength of his presence. As Elena leaned forward carefully to pour the wine, another waiter rushed out of the busy kitchen and bumped hard against her shoulder. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion as the bottle slipped from her fingers, sending a large arc of dark red liquid splashing violently across Isabella's flawless red dress. "You incompetent little rat!" Isabella shrieked in absolute fury, jumping up so quickly that her chair shrieked loudly against the marble floor. "Look at what you have done to my custom gown." Elena's face turned completely pale as she stammered out an apology, explaining that she had been bumped from behind. "I do not care about your pathetic excuses," Isabella roared, rubbing desperately at the stain with a cloth napkin, which only succeeded in making the dark spot look much worse. She then turned her immense rage fully onto Elena, her eyes burning with pure malice, as she screamed for the manager to fire the girl and place her on a black list across the entire city. Marcus, the sweat-drenched salon manager, materialized instantly to apologize profusely to the wealthy couple, ordering Elena to go straight to the kitchen because her shift was officially over. "Wait a single moment." A cool, solitary word cut through the chaotic noise like a sharp knife. Julian Brookfield remained seated comfortably, casually swirling the remaining wine in his own glass with an unreadable expression on his handsome face. "Julian, do not interfere," Isabella hissed angrily. But Julian merely remarked that the wine actually matched the red silk perfectly, causing someone at a nearby table to muffle a sudden laugh. Isabella's face turned bright purple with rage, as she demanded to know if he was actually defending a member of the low-wage waiting staff. Julian looked at Elena carefully for the very first time, noticing her frayed collar, her tired eyes, and the strands of brown hair falling from her messy bun. Yet he also noticed that she was not crying. She stood completely upright, with her jaw clenched in quiet defiance. "I am just saying," Julian drawled lazily, leaning back in his chair, "that firing her immediately is far too boring, and since we are celebrating our engagement, we should have a little bit of fun." "Fun?" Elena whispered, her voice barely audible over the chatter of the room. Julian stood up, towering over her easily, as he walked over to the small stage where a string quartet had just finished performing a light classical piece. On the wooden music stand lay an incredibly difficult piece of sheet music by Mozart, specifically the famous aria of the Queen of the Night, which the hired soprano had failed to sing properly earlier that evening. Julian picked up the sheet music, a cruel, sarcastic gleam appearing in his dark eyes as he decided to expose the complete absurdity of his fiancée's elitism. "I will tell you what," Julian announced loudly, his deep voice echoing clearly through the suddenly silent restaurant. "Isabella says you have absolutely no talent, but I believe that true talent can sometimes be found hidden away in the absolute dirtiest of places." He walked directly back to Elena and pressed the complicated music into her trembling hands, challenging her to sing the notoriously difficult piece. "This piece requires a remarkably high F note," Julian mocked, his voice dripping with dark sarcasm. "If you can actually sing this perfectly, without screeching like a dying animal, I will personally ensure that Marcus does not fire you from your job tonight." He paused for a dramatic moment, a wicked smile curling his lips, as he looked around at the shocked faces of the wealthy elite. He decided to raise the stakes to an impossible level just to mock the false sanctity of his own shallow engagement. Furthermore, Julian proclaimed to the entire room, "If you perform this Mozart piece flawlessly, I will leave Isabella right here and marry you instead." The room gasped loudly in pure shock, and Isabella's mouth dropped open as she angrily told him that his joke was not funny at all. "I am completely serious," Julian lied smoothly, fixing his intense gaze on the pale waitress. "Come on, girl, sing for your dinner, or sing for $1 billion. It was a cruel, public jest, meant to humiliate her, and everyone in the room waited for Elena to break down into tears, drop the paper, and run away into the kitchen. Elena looked down at the complex musical notes on the page, and the German words blurred slightly before her eyes. Der Hölle Rache kocht in meinem Herzen. She knew these notes perfectly. In fact, she knew them far better than she knew her own name. Elena slowly raised her head, completely ignoring the furious gaze of Isabella, and looked directly into Julian Brookfield's eyes. "Does the orchestra know the proper key for this piece?" she asked, in a remarkably calm, steady voice. For a fraction of a second, Julian's arrogant smile faltered slightly in surprise. "Which key?" he asked, to which Elena firmly replied, "D minor, and I need to know if they can play it." The entire atmosphere in the obsidian vista shifted instantly from amused condescension to a confused, tense silence, as Julian blinked in disbelief. He had fully expected her to beg for her job, or offer a stuttering apology, not demand a specific musical key from the professional musicians. "These are substitute musicians from the prestigious City Philharmonic," Julian answered slowly, his genuine curiosity finally aroused. Elena nodded once, and her cheap black shoes clicked loudly against the floor as she walked toward the stage. A small voice in her head screamed at her to stop, reminding her of the solemn promise she made to herself to never sing again after her life was ruined. She was supposed to be Elena Vance, the invisible waitress now, not the rising opera star she used to be. Yet, the burning humiliation inflicted by Isabella had awakened a fierce dragon that had been sleeping deeply inside her soul for 3 long years. She reached the grand piano, where the elderly pianist named Mr. Henderson looked up at her with immense pity, softly telling her that she did not have to do this. "D minor, Mr. Henderson," Elena said firmly, placing her hand on the smooth wood of the piano, as her trembling completely stopped. "A fast tempo, please. Do not wait for me, because I will keep up with you." Mr. Henderson hesitated, looking over at Julian, who gave a brief, sharp nod of approval before the pianist placed his experienced fingers onto the keys. The aggressive, turbulent opening chords of the famous aria erupted through the silent room, and Isabella crossed her arms with a smug grin, waiting for the horrible screeching to begin. Julian leaned casually against a marble pillar, swirling his drink as he waited for the absolute disaster to unfold, so he could finally go home. Elena closed her eyes tightly, took one massive, deep breath, and then she opened her mouth. The very first note did not simply emerge. It exploded into the room like a spear of pure, crystal-clear sound that pierced the air with shocking power. Julian's glass froze halfway to his mouth as the immense volume and flawless operatic coloratura technique filled the space. This was absolutely not the thin, breathy voice of an amateur. It was a rich, dark, and terrifyingly precise operatic instrument. Her German diction was entirely flawless, and the emotion pouring from her was raw, unfiltered rage channeled through a lifetime of perfect classical training. Elena no longer looked like a tired waitress. Her posture had completely transformed into that of a queen, her spine like solid steel, as her hands gestured gracefully through the air. The wealthy guests at the nearby tables slowly lowered their silver forks, their mouths hanging wide open in absolute astonishment. Then came the most difficult part of the piece, the legendary staccato run, containing the high F notes that served as a graveyard for even the most experienced professional sopranos. Elena struck the first high note with the absolute precision of a laser beam, her voice ringing out like a beautiful, clear bell. She whirled through the complex arpeggios with frightening vocal agility, pouring 3 long years of scrubbing dirty floors and being completely invisible into a melody that demanded total dominance. Julian Brookfield felt a violent shiver run straight down his spine as the hairs on his arms stood on end. He had grown up sitting in expensive opera boxes, and his own grandmother had been a major patron of the arts, so he knew exactly what true greatness sounded like. This was not merely good, it was world-class, an impossible feat performed by a woman in a stained apron and cheap shoes. All of her physical flaws seemed to fade away into nothingness, leaving only the immense power radiating from her throat in a display of fierce, terrifying beauty. Isabella Thorne had turned completely pale, her smug grin replaced by an expression of absolute horror as she realized she was no longer looking at a servant, but a dangerous rival. Elena reached the final, resolving cadence of the aria, holding the massive closing note with a lung capacity that defied all medical logic. She allowed the magnificent sound to echo violently through the crystal chandeliers until the very air in the room vibrated, before cutting it off into absolute silence. A suffocating silence blanketed the room for 5 long seconds, and nobody dared to move a single muscle. Mr. Henderson stared down at the piano keys, his old hands trembling with emotion, while Elena stood on the stage gasping for air as the adrenaline rushed through her veins. Suddenly, the reality of what she had just done washed over her, and she realized she had completely exposed her hidden identity to the world. She looked over at Julian, who was no longer smiling or looking bored. He was staring at her with an intensity that made her knees feel weak. Slowly, Julian Brookfield began to clap his hands in a slow, rhythmic motion, and within moments, the entire wealthy elite of the city rose to their feet in a thunderous standing ovation. They completely forgot that she was just the waiting staff, entirely ignoring the spilled wine as they cheered for her. Isabella stood frozen in pure rage, violently grabbing Julian's arm and telling him to stop clapping for what she called a trained circus horse. Julian coldly shook her hand off without even looking at her, walking directly toward the stage like a predator circling its prey. "Who in the world are you?" Julian asked, his voice rough and stripped of its usual smooth, aristocratic polish. Elena stepped back defensively, clutching her apron tightly as she whispered that she needed to get back to her work. "Our agreement was completely serious," Julian said firmly, stepping up onto the stage until he was only inches away from her. "I said that if you sang it perfectly, I would marry you." Elena looked him dead in the eyes and replied, "And I think we both know, Mr. Brookfield, that wealthy men make promises they never intend to keep." With that, she turned around and sprinted through the service doors, leaving him completely alone in the spotlight. Julian immediately ordered his chief of security, Arthur, to find out exactly who she was and bring her to his office the very next morning, regardless of whether she quit. Meanwhile, Elena did not stop running until her lungs burned and the gleaming skyline of the wealthy district was replaced by the dirty brick facades of her neighborhood. With trembling hands, she unlocked the peeling blue door of her cramped apartment and slid down against it onto the cold laminate floor. She had actually sung tonight, breaking her 3-year silence and resurrecting the ghost of Elena Vance, the former prodigy whose life had imploded in a single night. "Elena, is that you?" A soft, raspy voice called out from the small bedroom. Elena gathered her composure, wiped her stained uniform, and walked in to see her younger brother, Leo, lying in bed, surrounded by medication bottles and a humming dialysis machine. He was dangerously pale, his skin looking almost translucent under the harsh overhead bulb, but his eyes were bright with concern. Elena forced a brave smile, falsely claiming that she had simply decided to quit her job tonight. Leo's eyes widened in fear as he reminded her about the expensive rent and his life-saving medical treatments. "I will find a new job tomorrow, even if I have to scrub toilets," Elena promised fiercely, stroking his hair. "I will get you that kidney transplant, Leo. I promise you." Leo looked at her closely, noting that she suddenly looked the way she used to before their mother died and before the massive scandal destroyed her opera career. The night her voice broke during her major conservatory audition because someone had maliciously drugged her water bottle, leading to rumors of drug addiction and stability issues that ruined her reputation completely. While Elena comforted her brother, Julian Brookfield sat in his luxury penthouse across town, staring out at the city lights with a glass of scotch in his hand. Arthur entered the modern room and placed a thin beige file on the glass table, explaining that her real name was Elena Vance, 24 years old. He revealed that before she was a waitress, she was a top-tier scholarship student at the prestigious Juilliard School of Music. Julian's eyes narrowed as he read an old newspaper clipping detailing her sudden onstage collapse and the subsequent rumors that destroyed her promising career. She did not fail because of pressure, Julian muttered, remembering the sheer steel in her voice at the restaurant. Arthur then dropped a massive bombshell, explaining that the cruel rumors had been tracked directly back to a public relations firm owned entirely by Isabella Thorne's wealthy family. Isabella had been a mediocre mezzo-soprano student at the exact same conservatory that year, and she had used her family's immense wealth to crush a far more talented rival. A dark, freezing rage settled deep into Julian's chest, as everything finally made perfect sense to him. He looked down at the expensive engagement ring that Isabella had furiously thrown at him in the car on the way home. The only reason he had even proposed to her was to satisfy his company's board of directors, who insisted he marry a stable, wealthy woman before his upcoming 33-year-old birthday to secure his inheritance. "Arthur, prepare the vehicle immediately," Julian ordered firmly, buttoning his tailored jacket. "We are driving straight to her apartment right now." The heavy, authoritative knock on the door at 2 o'clock in the morning terrified Elena, who grabbed a wooden baseball bat before creeping over to ask who was there. "Julian Brookfield," the deep voice responded through the wood, telling her that he owned the building and demanding she open the door or he would have security break the lock. Elena unchained the door slightly, and Julian stood in the shabby hallway, looking completely out of place in his luxury tuxedo. He refused to leave, threatening to discuss her brother's massive medical debts right there in the hallway for all of her neighbors to hear if she did not let him in. Elena opened the door fully, and they stood in her tiny, cramped kitchen as she angrily demanded to know what he wanted from her. "Isabella is no longer my fiancée, as I ended it an hour ago," Julian said calmly, pacing around the small room. He explained that according to his grandfather's strict trust agreement, he was required to be legally married within the next 3 weeks, or the board would officially remove him as CEO. He admitted that his public challenge at the restaurant had started as a cruel joke, but since she fulfilled the condition perfectly, he was offering a transaction. He needed an intelligent, strong wife to play the role of Mrs. Brookfield for a single year to secure his company, after which they would quietly divorce. In exchange, he offered to immediately move Leo to a private wing of the best hospital, hire the top kidney specialists in the country, and pay off every single penny of her debts. Elena stared at him, realizing it was a dangerous pact with the devil, but the sound of her brother coughing in the next room made her desperation flare. "What are the exact conditions?" she whispered quietly. Julian explained that they would marry secretly within 3 days, followed by a massive public wedding ceremony in 2 weeks to satisfy the press. She would move into his luxury penthouse, attend high-profile galas, and convince the world that she was the woman who had completely stolen his heart. When Elena asked if she would be forced to sing, Julian hesitated before softly telling her that she would only have to sing if she truly wished to do so. He then offered her a staggering sum of $10 million at the end of the 1-year contract, entirely separate from her brother's medical expenses. Elena took a deep, shaky breath, looking at the powerful billionaire who had publicly humiliated her, yet was now offering her the ultimate lifeline to save her brother's life. "Write down the contract immediately," Elena demanded, her eyes turning into flint. "But I want a strict clause stating that we will have entirely separate bedrooms, because this is a business arrangement, and I am your employee, not your mistress." A spark of genuine amusement and deep respect flashed in Julian's dark eyes as he agreed to her terms, noting that Isabella would have immediately thrown herself at his wealth. Elena took just 10 minutes to pack her meager belongings, stepped out of her past, and quietly entered the powerful world of the Brookfield family. 3 days later, the legal ceremony at the city registry office was incredibly fast, sterile, and witnessed only by Arthur to keep the press away. However, the real social storm began on the following Monday morning, when Elena stood inside the massive walk-in closet of Julian's penthouse. She was no longer wearing a cheap waitress uniform. Instead, She wore a beautifully tailored marine blue blazer and elegant white trousers. Julian walked into the room, stopping dead in his tracks as he saw her, completely forgetting about the business transaction because she looked absolutely breathtaking. He handed her a pair of dark sunglasses, warning her that they were about to step out to a massive press conference to publicly announce their marriage. He also dropped a piece of terrifying news, revealing that his formidable grandmother, the matriarch of the Brookfield family, was flying in directly from Paris. He explained that his grandmother controlled the entire family trust, absolutely loathed liars, and if she suspected for a single second that their marriage was a fake, the deal would be ruined. "You managed to conquer Mozart's most difficult aria," Julian said with a slight smirk as he opened the door for her. "I am sure you can handle an elderly woman with a silver walking cane." Elena nervously adjusted her sunglasses as they stepped into the private elevator, and Julian gently took her hand in his skin feeling incredibly warm against hers. "The curtain is officially rising, Mrs. Brookfield," he whispered softly, as the elevator descended rapidly toward a literal shark tank of aggressive reporters and a rocksüchtige Isabella Thorne. The elevator doors glided open at the lobby level, and the world outside instantly turned into a blinding flash of pure white light as hundreds of cameras exploded simultaneously. The deafening roar of questions from the chaotic crowd of paparazzi was absolutely overwhelming, but Julian guided Elena forward with absolute calm. Elena felt her heart hammering violently, but she pulled upon her years of classical training, reminding herself to wear a flawless mask of aristocratic confidence. Julian raised his large hand, and the rowdy room instantly fell completely silent, showcasing the absolute authority he held over the city. He smoothly introduced Elena as the woman who had completely stolen his heart and the new Mrs. Brookfield, stepping back to let her speak into the microphone. "Good morning," Elena said, her highly trained, resonant voice easily carrying to the furthest corners of the massive room without any effort. "I know you all have many questions." Suddenly, a shrill, furious voice interrupted from the side of the stage as Isabella Thorne stormed forward, looking like a rocksüchtige goddess in an expensive designer outfit. She bypassed the security line and held up a large, grainy photograph of Elena from 3 years ago, looking exhausted and ill as she left the hospital. "Tell them who you truly are, Julian's little darling!" Isabella shrieked triumphantly to the flashing cameras. "This is Elena Vance, the disgraced conservatory dropout and addict who collapsed on stage because she could not handle the pressure." The entire room erupted into an absolute frenzy, as reporters shouted brutal questions at Elena, asking if she had been in a drug rehabilitation clinic. Julian's jaw tightened in furious anger, and he immediately stepped forward to pull Elena away from the microphones, but she refused to move an inch. She looked at the old photograph, then looked directly at Isabella, realizing that the wealthy girl was acting out of pure, desperate malice. Elena stepped closer to the microphone, her voice ringing out with immense strength as she admitted her past name was indeed Elena Vance. "And yes, 3 years ago I was hospitalized," Elena continued firmly, her voice vibrating with controlled emotion. "But it was not because of drugs. It was because someone maliciously slipped a powerful sedative into my water bottle on the night of my grand debut to ensure I would fail." She stared directly at Isabella, and the cameras immediately followed her gaze as the wealthy heiress turned completely pale with sudden fear. Elena passionately explained how she had spent 3 long years working multiple low-wage jobs to pay for her sick brother's medical care after her mother died of a broken heart trying to clear her name. "I am a waitress, and I am incredibly proud of that fact," Elena proclaimed boldly. "Because while people like Miss Thorne were busy buying dresses that cost more than my annual rent, I was busy learning exactly what it means to survive." She turned to look at Julian, who was staring at her with pure awe, before she told the press that if anyone had an issue with her past, they could discuss it directly with her husband. The stunned silence in the room was suddenly broken by a senior reporter from a major newspaper who shouted out that this survival story was far better than any corporate business merger. The cameras began flashing wildly again, but the energy had completely transformed from judgment to absolute adoration for the beautiful, resilient Cinderella figure. Isabella stood frozen in absolute horror, realizing that her cruel public attack had accidentally handed Elena the ultimate public relations victory. Over the next 2 weeks, the luxurious penthouse became a whirlwind of wedding dress fittings, elite florists, and intense legal meetings regarding the upcoming public ceremony. Elena continued to sleep in the separate guest wing according to their strict contract, but the artificial boundaries between them began to blur significantly. They began sharing long breakfasts together, discussing complex global politics late into the night over cups of warm tea, and Julian quickly discovered that his new wife possessed a brilliant intellect. However, the ultimate test arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening, when Julian's formidable grandmother, Genevieve Brookfield, finally arrived at the penthouse for a private dinner. Genevieve sat at the head of the long table, a zierliche woman with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that could cut straight through glass. She used her silver walking cane to point aggressively at anything that displeased her, and so far she had loudly criticized the soup, the American weather, and the floral arrangements. "So, you are the singing waitress I have heard so much about," Genevieve remarked coldly, setting her silver spoon down with a loud clatter. She glared at Elena, demandingly asking if a girl from the slums truly believed she had the grace and competence to manage the massive Brookfield estate and handle the immense social pressure. Julian tried to intervene, but his grandmother sharply told him to remain quiet while she spoke directly to the young woman. Elena looked at the intimidating matriarch, instantly recognizing that Genevieve did not actually care about aristocratic birth, but rather about absolute competence. "I know that your tea is completely cold, madame," Elena said softly, causing the old woman to blink in absolute surprise. Elena calmly stood up from her chair, completely ignoring the servants, and walked over to the silver tea service on the side table. She explained that the water had been poured far too early, noting that the traditional Brookfield Earl Grey becomes incredibly bitter if left to steep too long. With smooth, highly practiced movements, Elena emptied the bitter liquid, brought the fresh kettle to a perfect boil, and prepared a flawless new pot of tea. She poured a fresh cup and placed it perfectly in front of Genevieve, ensuring the silver handle was facing exactly at the 3 o'clock position. "You are worried that I cannot handle the staff or the intricate details of this life," Elena said calmly as she took her seat again. "But madame, I have spent 3 long years serving the most demanding, arrogant people in this city, and I know how to anticipate a need before it is ever spoken aloud." She explained that a wealthy society dame simply assumes things will be done, whereas a professional waitress personally ensures that they are done perfectly. Genevieve stared down at the flawless cup of tea, took a slow, deliberate sip, and a long silence blanketed the tense dining room while Julian held his breath. "The tea is absolutely perfect," Genevieve whispered softly, a genuine, rare smile breaking through her strict, stony expression. She looked up at Elena, remarking that the girl possessed the hard-working hands of a laborer, but the proud, noble posture of a true queen. She tapped her cane loudly, declaring that Elena had survived the difficult dinner, which was an excellent start, allowing Julian to finally breathe a massive sigh of relief. Later that night, Elena stood out on the glass balcony, watching the heavy rain pelt against the city skyline, when she felt Julian's warm presence appear directly behind her. He praised her performance, noting that his grandmother had not complimented another human being since the late 90s. Elena turned around to face him, realizing he was standing far too close, the bright city lights reflecting beautifully in his dark, intense eyes. "I think you are a man who is entirely used to buying whatever he wants," Elena whispered, her voice trembling slightly, as his fingers gently brushed against her cheek. Julian softly told her that when he heard her sing on that stage, it was the very first time in his entire life that he had ever felt something completely real. "Burn the contract," Julian whispered hoarsely, leaning his face down toward hers as Elena's heart completely betrayed her business rules. Their lips met in a passionate, hungry kiss that had absolutely nothing to do with the cameras or the business transaction. It was the explosive release of weeks of hidden attraction, and Elena kissed him back with the absolute passion of a grand operatic aria. However, the beautiful moment was suddenly shattered by the loud ringing of Julian's private phone, and his face turned entirely pale as he listened to Arthur's voice. "Someone broke into the law firm and stole the original copy of our prenuptial agreement," Julian announced in total horror. He explained that the stolen document contained the specific details of the $10 million payment, proving to the world that their marriage was a complete fraud. "If Isabella releases that document to the press, or to my grandmother," Julian said, his knuckles turning white, "I will lose my company, and you will look like a greedy gold digger." With the massive public wedding scheduled in just 2 days, panic began to rise. But Julian fiercely swore that they would go on the absolute offensive against Isabella. The public wedding of Julian Brookfield and Elena Vance was hailed by the media as the absolute social event of the decade. The historic downtown cathedral was completely packed with over 1,500 elite guests, representing a literal sea of haute couture, old family money, and immense political power. Elena stood at the entrance of the massive, beautiful church, her arm tightly hooked into that of her brother, Leo, who looked healthier than he had in years, thanks to Julian's medical team. She wore a stunning custom gown made of exquisite silk and French lace, but beneath the luxury fabric, her heart hammered like a terrified bird. They had still not located the stolen contract, and Elena knew with absolute certainty that Isabella was hiding in the crowd, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the massive pipe organ roared to life with the traditional wedding march, Elena took a deep breath and began walking down the long aisle toward the altar. Julian stood waiting for her in a flawless morning coat, his jaw tightly clenched, though his eyes burned with the same raw passion she had felt on the balcony. She finally reached the altar, and the Archbishop began the traditional ceremony with immense gravity, his words washing over Elena like an unreal dream. Then came the fateful moment, when the priest asked the congregation if anyone knew a legal reason why the couple should not be wed. The sharp, echoing click of high heels against the marble floor suddenly shattered the silence, as Isabella Thorne stepped out into the center aisle. She was wearing a blood-red designer outfit, matching the exact color of the wine she had spilled, and she held the stolen beige folder high in her hand like a weapon. "This marriage is an absolute fraud," Isabella shrieked loudly, her malicious voice bouncing off the high stone ceilings as the media cameras began clicking furiously. She marched proudly up to the altar, loudly announcing to Genevieve Brookfield that the marriage was a cheap business transaction designed to deceive the board of directors. She pulled the stolen contract out and began reading Clause 4 aloud, exposing the $10 million payment and the agreement to cover Leo's medical bills. Total chaos immediately erupted inside the cathedral as reporters shouted, but Genevieve slowly stood up, causing the room to fall silent once again. The matriarch demanded to know if the accusations were true, and before Julian could formulate a clever corporate lie, Elena proudly stepped forward. "Yes, madame," Elena announced, her powerful operatic voice easily cutting through the tension of the room. "Every single word written in that contract is the absolute truth, because 3 weeks ago I was completely drowning, and your grandson offered me a lifeline to save my dying brother." She boldly declared that she felt absolutely no shame in sacrificing her own pride to save the people she loved, causing the image of a greedy gold digger to instantly shatter. Elena then turned directly to Julian, taking his cold hands into her own as she looked deeply into his eyes. completely ignoring the 1,500 spectators. "We signed a contract for a fake performance," Elena whispered softly to him. "But somewhere between the press conference and the moment you kissed me on the balcony, I completely forgot my fake lines." She turned back to the shocked crowd, declaring that Julian was the first man who had ever challenged her to sing louder instead of trying to silence her. She reached out, snatched the stolen contract from Isabella's frozen fingers, and violently ripped the $10 million agreement into tiny pieces, scattering them at her feet. "I do not want his money, and I officially terminate the contract right now," Elena proclaimed fiercely. "If you want to marry me, Julian Brookfield, you will marry Elena Vance with absolutely no deals and no financial timelines." Julian looked down at the shredded paper, then looked at Isabella, who was vibrating with fury because her ultimate trap had completely failed. A brilliant, genuine smile transformed Julian's handsome face as he stepped forward, grabbed Elena tightly by the waist, and pulled her close. "You are officially fired as my employee," Julian whispered hoarsely against her lips. "But I would love to permanently hire you as my wife, because I love you, Elena." He kissed her passionately right there at the altar before God and the press, cementing their love to the world. Suddenly, a slow, deliberate clapping sound echoed through the church as Genevieve Brookfield smiled with genuine amusement, declaring that this was far more entertaining than a standard wedding. The matriarch remarked that a girl who could tear up $10 million in a church was dangerous enough to officially bear the Brookfield name, ordering the priest to quickly finish the ceremony. Julian then signaled Arthur, who stepped forward with a thick envelope containing the definitive proof of Isabella's malicious doping scandal from 3 years ago. Isabella recognized the documents instantly, turned pale as a ghost, and fled down the aisle in total disgrace, followed by a pack of eager reporters. The rest of the wedding ceremony passed in a beautiful, happy blur, and as they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Leo gave them a tearful thumbs up. Julian pulled Elena into a private alcove for a single quiet moment before they stepped out to face the roaring crowds of the city. He happily promised her a remarkably long, expensive honeymoon, followed by the purchase of her very own grand opera house. Elena had not only won the heart of the billionaire, but she had successfully reclaimed her beautiful voice, saved her brother's life, and proved that the greatest risks in life often bring the most magnificent rewards. The profound journey of Elena Vance reminds us that human worth can never be measured by temporary circumstances, financial standing, or the uniforms we are forced to wear. Life often tests our spirits through periods of intense obscurity, forcing us into roles that feel entirely beneath our true potential. Yet it is precisely within those hidden valleys that our core character is forged into solid steel. True dignity does not arise from the wealth we possess, or the social status we project to the world, but from the quiet resilience that refuses to be shattered by the cruelty of elitism and superficial judgments. When we hold on to our integrity during moments of absolute despair, we create a beautiful, silent strength that cannot be bought, sold, or diminished by the shallow opinions of those who measure humanity by material success. The unexpected intersection of two entirely different worlds demonstrates that genuine human connection requires us to entirely burn the artificial contracts and transactions we create to protect our hearts. True love and mutual respect cannot flourish within the rigid boundaries of legal agreements or social expectations. They demand absolute vulnerability, the courage to speak our truth openly, and the willingness to stand completely exposed before the world. We must learn to look past the stained aprons and the superficial flaws of those around us, recognizing that magnificent talent and noble souls are frequently found hidden in the most unassuming, hard-working places. Ultimately, life rewards those who have the immense courage to tear up the safety nets of financial security and predictable transactions in pursuit of something entirely authentic. When we choose to sacrifice our pride for the survival of the people we love, we are not diminishing ourselves. Rather, we are participating in the highest, most human form of nobility that exists. We must always remember to sing our truth loudly, especially when the world demands our absolute silence, because a single authentic voice has the incredible power to shatter the grandest illusions of wealth and bring the most powerful forces to their knees. Let us walk through our remaining years with the proud posture of those who have survived the storms, understanding that our scars are not symbols of shame, but beautiful medals of absolute resilience and unconditional love. True wealth is found in the freedom to reclaim our stolen voices, the health of our loved ones, and the profound realization that the most valuable things in this life can never be given a monetary price.